So we have with us Niels van Willigen. Maybe Niels wants to wave. Perfect. Who is from Leiden University, where he's associate professor in international relations, and where he works on European security and defense, security studies, and at some point also the Balkans. So Niels, welcome and thanks for joining us. Then we have Magdalena Gora from Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And I'm very sorry, Magda actually had to cut her research fellowship in the US short due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, but we are still very happy that you can nevertheless join us. And Magda's work focuses a lot on collective identity, democracy, foreign policy, and of course also Polish foreign policy. So I think also already a very good separation between the Netherlands and the Polish views. I'm really looking forward to see what commonalities but also differences we'll see. Then we have Oriol Costa from IBEI Barcelona, who is also associate professor at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. And Oriol works a lot on the intersection between the EU and international organizations, and recently politicization and contestation. And maybe it's a good moment to publicize actually a special issue that Magda and Oriol are working together on the contestation of EU external relations. So I think that's also a nice project that fits very nicely in our discussion today. And then last but not least, we have Tomas Weiss from Charles University Prague, with whom together we are actually organizing this event, because Tomas is also the Jean Monnet Chair on teaching and debating EU small state security. And the theme of our workshop, of our session today, very much came out of a conversation that we had with Tomas time and again of, do small states actually react differently than the big ones? So I think that that's also will give us a very interesting, different perspective. These are our four speakers. As I was already saying, I will give all of them now 5 minutes to share their insights with them. And I really kept it quite general. So my first question to our four speakers was really, what are the main takeaways from the COVID-19 crisis in terms of European foreign policy cooperation? So I would now give the floor to one of the other. Afterwards, we will do a short reaction round, and then we will open up to everyone. Without further ado, I hand over to Tomas to share with us his insights from Prague, which in the end, in the Czech Republic, was a country that quite quickly went to lockdown. What did you take away for European foreign policy cooperation? Tomas, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Heidi, and thanks a lot for the invitation and for the organization of this whole series, and especially for giving the floor to small states ideas in this. I mean, I've been quite sorry to propose this issue for the past couple of hours while I was thinking about, what to say about the small states and to what extent they've been different. And I couldn't really come up with that many issues, frankly, because although the idea for the seminar sounded very, very nice, in the end, I actually think that the size doesn't really matter that much in this particular topic. Even though, well, I will obviously come up with some ideas how size does matter, but I think most of it is rather indirect than direct, because obviously what did matter, I think, was how quickly the states reacted, how quickly they went into the lockdown. And that didn't really necessarily, follow the size-related issues, would be my understanding at least. Although I would be very happy to be persuaded differently. So what are my main takeaways? I think first and foremost there was an instinctive national reaction, I think, and the EU level basically came only second. In most of the countries, small or big. And we've been struggling with that ever since, I guess. This is not that different from any other crises, I guess. And it is really something I would call an instinctive reaction. Second, I think, and that relates directly to foreign policy, I think there was a loss of attention to foreign policy, some sort of, turn inwards, dealing with the crisis that was inwards. That was inward located in a way and had to be dealt with within the countries. Although I think there was a very important transnational dimension to it, obviously, because, I mean, the crisis came from abroad, from outside of Europe, first and foremost. And I think there the size kind of matters a bit. because I guess that the loss of attention to foreign policy was much stronger in smaller states. And I think that is very much connected to the level of capacity that the smaller states have. So they basically refocused most of their administration to fighting COVID, and they simply didn't have that much time to deal with the normal politics. I think the bigger states that had more capacity could have lost a bit less attention. Another point would be, I think there was a small advantage of small states because they, at the height of the crisis, they needed less material to provide for their population. So if you are Germany and you need to provide, protection equipment for 80 million people, it is slightly different than if you are Slovenia and you need to care for 1.5 million. That is something like a side order for the big companies. So that might have been a bit easier. In longer term, I think the biggest state's advantage of bigger capabilities returns again, though. More cloud, more expertise, more capabilities, and more capacity to deal with the crisis and not to lose capacities that are simply seen as too much. I mean, just today there was a piece of news in the Czech media that said that the Czech state had planned to buy a new building in Brussels for the Czech EU Council presidency in 2022, and to locate all the Brussels-based Czech state institutions into one building. And probably, partly, and mainly because of COVID-19, they have dropped the plan. And we have, partly it is financial issues, partly it is organizational issues because they simply didn't have time to organize it, properly. But still, I mean, I think for the Czech presentation in the EU, for the Czech presence in the EU, this will be a huge loss in the longer term. And I think this is directly connected to the fact that the administration simply redirected the resources and attention elsewhere. And I think we will talk about that a bit later, but I think a huge issue for the future will be security and defense. Where again, the money will be redirected elsewhere exactly at the moment where we actually needed to increase the budgets. And many of our countries planned to increase the budgets. And I think if there is going to be any single casualty, it will be the European security capabilities, I guess. And I think I will stop here and wait for the others to contribute. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Tomas. So on the one hand, this idea, well, it's for many member states, of course, the national is very strong in foreign policy, and then the European is more for the cooperation. But I think also very interesting to really think about the budget implications of this crisis and how this will actually deal with foreign policy, but also, of course, security and defense. I now hand over to Oriol from Barcelona, of course, with a perspective from a country that had quite a different experience in the last weeks than the Czech Republic. Oriol, the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah. Quite a different experience. We are still in, we are just from yesterday, we've been able to visit our parents or our friends. And this is the first time for the last, since the 12th of March. And since yesterday was the first time my kid was allowed to play with other kids since the 12th of March. So it's tough. Yeah, it has been tough. Nevertheless, if I can, I would leave the issue of size aside, at least for a moment. Also, I'm not a comparativist, which I guess saves me from addressing that kind of factors, which are of course key. But I would like to say a thing or two on COVID-19 and its implications for EU foreign policy. Perhaps going along the line that Tomas took just at the end of his first intervention here. But there are lots of moving parts in this regard. I guess the first one is what will happen to the EU itself, which is probably the big elephant in the room. I have to say that down here, it has been experienced as a great shock over the size and shape of political community. It has been a big revelation. I think that might be the word for that. We'll perhaps have the chance to go back to this later. But of course, this is what most of the Spanish foreign policy has been about, right? Trying to deal with the EU response to COVID-19 and more particularly to the economic crisis, and probably finally at some point the debt, sovereign debt crisis this will become. Other than that, we have been an object instead of a subject of foreign policy, I guess. But again, perhaps we have the chance to go back to this later on. Another moving part is what impact this will have on the US elections in November. And finally, of course, what impact this will have on the US-China rivalry, right? But anyway, I think that there are a couple of arguments that one can make in order to think about what will be the implications of COVID-19 on EU foreign policy. Probably the best thing to do here is to go back to our priors and check them again, right? And the first one I would say is that the rules-based international liberal order has been instrumental in the development of the EU and also of the EU as an international actor, right? If war made the state, right, in this Tilly way, then perhaps international liberal order made the EU and EU foreign policy, right? And this is true at least in two different ways. The first is international liberal order is more predictable and is less crisis prone than other kinds of international orders. And it also makes hard power, of course, it's a valuable currency, but not the only valuable currency, right? Hard power is just alongside many other resources that one can mobilize in order to have influence at the international sphere. And also it makes that this is exactly this predictability and stability is what makes structural power, for instance, or having milieu goals, sensible strategies, because you can invest in the long term, right, in improving the environment in which you want to live. And from a more of a pragmatic point of view, on many occasions, international norms and rules have become reference points in EU debates, in internal EU debates, right? So consensuses have been articulated around those international norms and rules. So in a way, the EU has been good friends with multilateral institutions, but then the other way around, multilaterally negotiated norms have become also key in intra-EU debates to make agreement possible, right? So I guess that the erosion of the international liberal order, which seems to be a rather straightforward implication of this crisis, is challenging for EU foreign policy cooperation. I mean, if you have a functioning World Health Organization, then there are many strategic debates that the EU does not need to have, right? And in many ways, there are many ways in which the EU can contribute to global health objectives if there is a well-functioning WHO. But that's of course not the case if the WHO becomes a matter of political conflict, right? And then of course, how close you are to the US administration becomes also part of your calculations in EU internal debates. So there are many ways in which everything becomes much more complicated when the World Health Organization is part of, becomes contested, right? It is part of big political conflicts internationally. And of course, beyond the WHO, there are many other organizations that have been eroding for a long time. So here, COVID-19 would be an accelerator of previous trends. Take the WTO, that would be probably the obvious example here. The crisis of the WTO makes many aspects of EU trade policy obsolete, right? How do you go about remaking internal consensuses that would make a new policy possible? I think that is a real question. So I think that the EU should understand that it can play by the rules created for rules created for different circumstances, and that it's a good old rule book might be out of sync now with the broader trends in international politics. And this brings me to my final point here, which has to do with the second prior, right? So will the EU be able to adapt? Will the EU be able to adjust itself to the new situation? And here, of course, the second prior would say that the decision-making procedure in the EU is not really geared towards taking quick transformative decisions, right? That it makes adaptation and adjustment, particularly of a strategic kind, as not just changing the parameters of some decisions, but really reassessing the kind of world order you live in. Probably that is not an easy thing if you take that sort of decisions through the kind of procedures that the EU has, right? To say the least. So it is frankly dysfunctional, and it also depends on informal mechanisms that we know that we're already eroding before the COVID-19 crisis, right? And there's emerging literature here on de-Europeanization and renationalization, and how some of these processes that made agreements easier within the EU, in particular within the Council, have been breaking down for some time now. So I guess that also the second prior is sort of a challenge, right? It is. I think that the whole COVID-19 crisis is, in a way, it pushes the international politics farther down the road that it had already been traveling from some time ago, and it is worrying for the EU as an international actor. That would be my take, my upbeat take.
Thank you very much, Oriol. So on the one hand, a lot of things that just got stronger, but at the same time, I think also something in connection with what Tomas was saying, this idea that this instinctive returning to national was quite visible and will, of course, also accelerate some of the trends that you were describing. Let's see if Magda from Krakow has a bit more of a positive outlook. Magda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Heidi, for having me. Thank you, NORTIA and TeDEUSS, right, for hosting the event. To wonderful networks. My experience is specific on personal level because I am indeed a Fulbright scholar at NYU at the moment. Even though I had to go back from New York in the middle of pandemic to Poland. And that brought my reflection to two major points, because I think one of the important elements in our reflection is really a question: what is the nature of this crisis? How much can we assess today after a couple of months? And what's going to be the long, what and how far-reaching the consequences of this are going to be? And how we can assess the responses so far. And I think two perspectives came to my mind. The first one is that the crisis serves as an enabler. And that is somehow along the line of what Tomas and Oriol already said. The crisis was immediate enabler of the nation state, right? It was the first one to react, regardless of whether you were in Europe or in the US. But at the same time, this nation state showed significant flaws in that reaction. Many of those flaws coming from globalization, weakening of the structure. When I was in New York, one of the major phases of the crisis response became Governor Cuomo. And he, as a responder on the regional level, well, state level in the US, right, become the person providing everyday information, not only for New Yorkers, but also for people all over the world, because his conferences were broadcasted by CNN every day. So when we look at this enabling effects, I think several issues are important for the nation state. And one of the important things, which again brings me to the American/Polish experience, is that the responses on the national level were very much depending on where in the political cycle life the given government was. Both in the case of the US, which Oriol I think mentioned, this happened in the early phase of a political campaign in the middle of the Democratic primaries. which had an important effect in Poland. This was mostly the question how to organize elections in the middle of pandemic, which in the end of the day, so in other words, in some countries, the response was, it seems to me, more about how to deal with the crisis. In other countries, the response was how to deal with the crisis while you are actually in the middle of a heated political conflict and how to deal with that, right? And that was not easy. The solutions were not simple, and they're not gonna be simple in a month to come, because the question of postpone elections, form of election, and so on, it is sort of, but one of these enabling elements of a nation state brings me to my to reflect on the relation between to go back to the European context more, to reflect on how this nation state and particularly the executives within those nation states started to build their relations with the European Union. Oriol, I think, said already that, and Tomas as well, that the nation state came first and then the EU reacted. We all know the competences of the European Union and the health issues, right? It's coordinative, it's not decisive, but it actually became an enabler, a factor for the governments that we can call sovereignists, those governments within the European Union that are actually engaged currently in a very specific debate about the future of European integration, right? We all probably know that we supposed to have at the beginning of the conference on future of Europe in May, which was postponed due to the crisis. But those sort of visions of a future integration, they are in a place. And what happened in governments which sort of had this sovereignist view, that they sort of started to play out with this, what we call othering of the European Union, right? So they were utilizing this nation, this phenomena of rallying around the flag, that citizens immediately had the instinct to support nation state in responses, because this is the one that possesses the capabilities necessary and resources necessary for citizens to feel safer in a crisis, such as healthcare, access to social security nets, and so on, right? But they started to utilize it to play a game with the EU. And obviously the familiar tropes of blame game came out, right? In national capitals, all faults are the EU, all successes are the government. This is something that we know, right? But at the same time, when they were sort of using those tropes, at the same time, you can see that this game is like two levels. On the one hand, is specifically the sovereignist governments, those ones that want to somehow promote a certain vision of European integration, which still protects sovereignty when they see or they share relatively pessimistic assessments of deepening integration and so on, that also this crisis, as many crises before, revealed these tensions between how you construct a communication towards your domestic audience and how you play the game on the European level. And I think the Polish case is quite revealing. On domestic level, the government officials were sort of highlighting the EU's slow reactions or no reaction, even the irrelevance. On the other hand, playing the game on the European Union level, supporting some governments and specifically within the framework of the multi-level financial framework negotiations, sort of presenting themselves as calling for solidarity and so on. So I think this is sort of interesting how this crisis showed us those elements, whether they are going to stay with that and what is going to be the outcome of this sort of future of European integration structure, I think is still undecided. But the second point, which I'll make very short, is that crisis also served as amplifier, which again, a lot of people stressed already, or as accelerator, which I think is Borrell's frame, which he used recently. So, and that specifically is visible in transatlantic relations, right? And one thing that I want to pinpoint here, both in a sort of more intra-European, but also international relations and specifically transatlantic relations, I think that this crisis really it acts as an amplifier, which means that it actually make the existing problems more visible or makes them bigger, right? And one of the most important things for me in transatlantic relations was this, the public trust issue, right? We've heard those stories that the Washington has abdicated from the leadership, which was, I think, a frame used in Newsweek. But if we think about those relations and we sort of try to think if there is any positive way out of this, a statement by scholar from Harvard Kennedy School, Catherine Ashburn Clover, was returning to me. She said that if we are gonna search for sort of possible strengthening of transatlantic relations, we need to think about restoration of the most critical ingredient of resilience, which is public trust. And I think this is very interesting, both domestically, sort of intra-European and in EU's relations with other, that the crisis really undermined many of those crucial components for those relations. And we're gonna, I think, see a lot of far-going consequences of this one.
Thank you very much, Magda. So I think also quite a nice connection to our previous speakers, but also some other new ideas. And I really like this idea of the othering of the EU as a tool for governments to seem strong and to pretend actually that they can do more than probably they can. And I found it also very interesting that in another webinar that looked at Eastern Europe, for example, they made or in Central Europe, they made the point that, well, if the EU helps, actually no one sees it, because then it's through the state. Whereas when other countries come and help, it's much more visible. Niels, in the Netherlands, quite a different country from the first three. What's the mood there? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Heidi. First of all, thank you for organizing this and inviting me. There's a lot to say, of course, also about the Netherlands, and I will do so in a few minutes. But let me first start about reflecting a little bit on the theme, which is foreign policy lessons. Not so much indeed connected to the size of states, because I also think that is hard to do at this moment. In my opinion, and that's my first point, the first observation from this crisis is that, and it has been more or less also said by others on this panel, is that the national reactions dominate, right? There are so many differences, both in terms of timing, when were borders closed, when were incoming flights banned, and so forth and so on, but also in terms of measures. Costa just started this panel by saying that his kid was locked up for almost 2 months. That is not the case in the Netherlands, and it's not the case in Sweden and some other countries. Kids could here play on the street from the beginning of the lockdown, and that's why also it was called a light lockdown or a smart lockdown, coined by our Prime Minister. So there have been lockdowns all throughout the EU, but all of them were often quite different towards each other. So I think that has to do with national political cultures. A lockdown like in Spain or in France would have created, I think, more problems in the Netherlands, because it would, I think, not be accepted by the population the way that it was done in France or in Spain. Of course, it's a counterfactual, we don't know for sure. But I do think, and that would be an interesting research line for the future, to see to what extent national political cultures have motivated the type of the choice for the lockdown that was actually chosen in a specific country. Second point is that EU coordination, of course, has been suboptimal, and it's hard because the EU doesn't have that much to say when a pandemic is going around all the world, and governments need to react. It's also a matter of competences. What can the EU do? What can't the EU do? But of course, in terms of opening borders or closing borders, and especially now again opening borders and making decisions about whether people can go on holidays, spend their holidays abroad, and so on and so forth, that is of course something that should be and could be done at the EU level. And of course, also the point I will get to is European solidarity in terms of support in different ways, financially and otherwise. But first, the third point I want to make is that actually it's quite, well, it's not funny, that's the wrong word, but it's interesting to note that this panel was titled "Does Size Matter? Foreign Policy Lessons from European Responses to COVID-19. You would expect that then it's about the EU in the world, relations with China, with Russia, with the United States, but we're all talking more about intra-European foreign policy. If I think about European foreign policy, I think about the discussions between France and Germany, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, and so forth and so on, the different camps that exist right now in relation to the financial solidarity within the EU. So EU external relations are quite absent, and that's worrying because a lot of things are going on in the world. Just to make a very recent development that well, is quite worrying and might have been missed by many people, but another Cold War mechanism has died, namely the Open Skies Treaty between Russia, of course, before the Soviet Union, and the United States, and almost all European countries. The United States has decided to step out of the treaty. There's a 6-month transition period, and likely, of course, is that Russia will follow. And that, of course, leaves the question, what will Europe do? And actually, it's also for Europe a very important treaty. This is only one example. It's an important example, but it's only one example of things going on in the world, not related to COVID, which are very important and also very important for Europe to take a position on and to think about in terms of external foreign policy. But I think as long as this COVID crisis is still here, it's hard to refocus also on these larger non-COVID related issues. And then the final point is related to the Netherlands and also to what is going to happen next. As you might know, there is this recent plan drafted by France and Germany to deal with the financial crisis, the economical crisis, which will occur, which is already occurring actually. And then there is the so-called Frugal Four, consisting of the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, and Austria, that made their own plan. And of course, currently it's debated in Brussels what to do with these plans. And this week there will be an announcement of some measures taken by Brussels. There's of course the discussions about the multi-annual financial framework are of course going on. So it will be exciting to see what will be the outcome. But what we already know is that, and that has been the case since the beginning of the crisis. And actually, it has been the case from before the COVID crisis, because if you look at the earlier negotiations about the MFF, you already saw different camps emerging of the Netherlands and their allies saying we don't want to increase the EU budget much more. And now these same countries are saying we want to help out. There must be some financial aid to the especially to the southern countries, but not based on gifts or based on subsidies or whatever. It must be a loan. So at some time it should be come back. And I think this is a very worrying issue at this moment, because it splits the EU between countries that want to focus on economical reforms and strict financial measures and so forth and so on, and countries that say, listen, at this point, we should not do that because we have a huge crisis and we first need to deal with that. To have some closing words, I think that when we talk about foreign policy related to the EU, the coming months, it will be more about these internal issues rather than about relations of the EU with the world outside.
Thank you very much, Niels. 4 different perspectives, all a bit gloomy, I have to say. But before we open up the round, I think what was very interesting here now really was also this notion that, well, can we actually differentiate, can we disentangle foreign policy thinking from national politics? I think also something that came back in Magda's comments. And what I found very interesting when listening to this was really this idea of variation. Yes, member states are different, we had different reactions, but how much can you be different, really? And what I found interesting that it was then used by governments to say, I'm different, I'm better. Not necessarily saying, okay, maybe we have different situations and there are different ways of getting out of this thing. But very often you had this notion, well, we are doing it and look at the others, they're not so good. So I think also interesting discourse level there. I now asked the speakers, or I proposed to the speakers that we do a short reaction round before we open up for question and answer. And I would really encourage everyone, try to stick to 1 or 2 points, so maximum 2 minutes per speaker. And we wanted to shuffle up the order a bit. So I would now hand over the floor to Oriol, in case you have any reactions, any comments, or want to emphasize anything from the others.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to say a word or two on the return to the national, and I would like to focus on the policy and the politics side of this. And the first one is that, I mean, where would you go if not the national? I mean, is the EU good at crisis? I mean, the EU is not supposed to be good at crisis. The EU is not designed to be good at crisis. Following rules doesn't make you a good crisis responder, right? Because crisis is a moment in which rules are less useful, to put it, you know, mildly and gently, and particularly in a crisis in which you will shut down your national economy for 2 months, you know, and for the first time ever, May has seen in Spain, May has seen the retirement bill, so the money spent on retirement, go down from the previous months in Spain. Because enough old people have died to make the retirement bill lower than it was in April. You know, this is how big this has been, right? I don't know about the experience elsewhere, but I mean, here everybody knows somebody who has been in hospital, a friend or two. Everybody knows somebody who has lost a parent. I have 2 friends who have lost. I mean, it is not something that you see in the internet here, right? So of course, where would you go? You go somewhere that has some crisis fighting capacities, and it is not geared to that. And it is not that it has many other logics in its arsenal, right? It basically, it took the ECB, which is a federal structure with not an intergovernmental but a federal supranational decision-making procedure. It took the ECB until the summer of 2011 to go into crisis-fighting mode, right? And then there's the politics of this. You know, climate change and the rise of China, which you know are of these historically long durée proportions, make for a crisis-prone 21st century. And no, and this assessment has become part of pop culture, I would say. You know, you see this in TV shows and so on, right? So you know, this is just the beginning of something that is gonna be going on for many decades. So I think it is really important for the EU to get the COVID-19 crisis right, because it's gonna signal many people beyond, you know, the kind of people that we pay attention to this, right? Beyond the classical EU types. It's going to signal whether the EU can be redesigned or not to go into a crisis prone world, right? And I think that the development of the last few weeks in the EU can actually be promising. You know, the fact that the coalition of states saying this is not about rules anymore, we should be thinking about reforming this to be able to act with some political discretionality, because this is really serious and we shouldn't be playing by the old rule books. I think that the fact that the group of states could think of this as needing a European response as opposed to a national response, which would be the frugal four countries' position, I guess. I think that this meta debate, so to speak, about national response or European response, right? I think this is promising, right? It's not that it is super easy to make a decision on that, because there are many veto players, but the fact that we are having the debate is already something.
Thank you very much, Oriol. Magda?
Thank you. I think I'd like to engage with 2 points that were made before. The first one is the inward-looking mindset for both some nation states or member states, but the EU as a whole. And I think this is something that we're gonna witness, and it's mostly connected with the lesson learned from the previous crisis that the EU had. That sort of the medium-term consequence of this is that that the EU is mostly occupied with solving internal tensions, which were already mentioned here, and then it takes less attention to the external, so to say, and that is something that is, I think, worrying, in a sense that this crisis globally is increasing tensions, is destabilizing system, is this sort of diminishes the governance principles and rules, and ultimately it also brings rifts in or between transatlantic partners. And I'm returning to this mostly because it seems to me that this is for Europeans, this is the key elements to see. But one interesting thing when I bring my sort of American perspective into this, which gives a little bit of a silver lining, is that when I was listening to the debates in the US while the crisis was unfolding, I was not able to escape from the fact how the states were fighting between themselves and how they were playing the game within a federal structure, to some extent similarly to how member states are doing this within the European Union. So in the end of the day, when you have very limited resources, specifically when it comes to ventilators or PPE, which I think Tomas mentioned, the size matter, how much you need, but also, you know, you have the countries that are differently tackled by the volume of a crisis, right? We have Spain or Italy, or we have Poland. And then the sort of reactions would be different because the victimhood is different, the needs are different, right? So I think this kind of, what I'm trying to say maybe here is that this is happening elsewhere, and that this does not necessarily means that the EU is failing, or because it actually, the problem is whether you're gonna find a place, a platform to strengthen. And one of the interesting phenomena that seemed to me is also in which institutions intra-EU you can see the activity. It was, in the end of the day, executive institutions, right, that played the role. The European Commission becoming the leader with some member states, while some authors claim that the intergovernmental institutions failed because the member states could not sort of come to the agreement. And I think this is also interesting when you look into the long-term internal dynamics within the European integration in months to come. But no matter what we're gonna say, I think the one thing is important for all foreign policy people is to know that no matter how we assess the long-term consequences of this crisis for Europe, we also know that a lot of financial instruments are gonna be targeted inside, which means that EU will not have those instruments to invest them elsewhere. And if you again listen to those contesters in a way like friendly or allies, like the American experts, one thing that they repeat is that maybe this is the moment when EU should prioritize its foreign policy places and stop. And I think this is one of the my most interesting takeaways from observing how the Americans are looking at what happens in Europe is this observation that maybe the EU should realistically assess how much it can afford at the moment when it comes to foreign policy, and how this global, you know, position needs to be managed. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Magda. Maybe just on a side note, I was joking with a friend that we were looking to see what the EU position was on foreign policy in the last 2 months, but there were no Foreign Affairs Council, so there are no conclusions. So you can listen to the High Representative who gives you an update on the press conference, in the press conference. But for the rest, actually, there is not much paper trail, which I think is also interesting for researchers. This said, I now hand over to Niels for a short reflection and then to Tomas. Niels, you have to put on your microphone, sorry.
All right. Yes, so following also on what Magda said, it's a different crisis, unprecedented. It's totally different from earlier crises. But what will be the same is indeed the internal looking reflex for the coming years. At the same time, I'm not sure whether it will really have that negative effect on the further development of European security and defense structures, whatever defined. Because I think that this time the EU doesn't have a choice. Developments are going quite fast outside in the outside world. Not in the least the further development and rise of China with the masks diplomacy and whatever, also within the EU. And we have also seen that, and that is also something that populations were very surprised of, is that whereas all kinds of protests in European countries with a lot of pain maybe led to some extra spending on health or education or whatever, and then suddenly there's a crisis and there are billions available. So money can be made to a certain extent. And I think that we have come to a point that external challenges will simply be too big to ignore. So although there will be a lot of attention and a lot of energy going to the internal dimensions of the EU and tackling the economic crisis that is building up, there will still be sufficient attention for the external relations, because I think there's no alternative.
Thank you very much, Niels. Tomas.
Thanks. I've got a couple of points reacting to all the other speakers. First, when Oriol talks about the size of the crisis, this is really something completely different across the countries. I mean, there have been something like 250 deaths or COVID-19 related deaths in the Czech Republic. I think the number of deaths in April in the Czech Republic was actually lower than the long-term average for April, because people were in lockdown, so there were no, they were not in cars, they didn't catch other diseases. So it actually helped in terms of, the number of public deaths. So the understanding of the crisis in the Czech society will be completely different, right, than it is going to be in a couple of years in Italy or in Spain. And I think this will make a difference for EU debates, for the debate on solidarity and so on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the issue of culture that I think Niels mentioned, the political culture. I think the political culture in Central Europe, and I'm very skeptical on that, actually helped at the beginning because the people were not surprised by the state actually locking them down. They just took it. Okay, that's how things are. No real debate about that, unlike in the Netherlands or in Sweden, where there was a huge opposition. The state is, however, much worse in actually organizing something. So you know, prohibiting things from happening and locking people down in their homes, they can do that pretty easily. But doing something constructively, helping the businesses, they have so far they have massively failed in that, right? But they have taken a very, very huge, you know, PR spin. We have so few deaths, so we've been successful. And in the end, they will be helped from the EU, and we will depend on how Germany manages it. So in the end, the administration can actually get away with that pretty easily. And this will not really help the political culture in the longer term. And in Central Europe especially, we know that we have had problems with political culture. So that's another thing. And the third thing, I think, acceleration. So some of you raised the point, and I agree with that. And in the Czech case, what I've seen is the acceleration of the domestic-driven foreign policy. So doing foreign policy for domestic political purposes, short-term political gains, you know, cheap points, no real long-term foreign policy structures or ideas or directions. And I think this is, again, going to emphasize that, accelerate that, and increase that, which is, again, you know, a very cynical and negative point. So I will try to end up with at least partly silver lining. I think how the EU will come out of that is with a stronger push to variable geometry. And I think that the core Europe will actually move forward more easily. And well, I mean, there will be obviously hiccups and struggles. We've seen it already, but there will be some sort of core Europe really moving forward. That will be the silver lining for the EU and the idea of the EU in general. It is not a silver lining for my country, I think, and for the region, because we are definitely not going to be part of that, for which I'm very, very sorry. But I think the crisis will actually accelerate the emphasis on the enhanced cooperation in many more areas and the variable geometry Europe. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tomas. I had to laugh, at least internally, because of course core Europe is just a good idea and a silver lining if you think it's a good idea. Otherwise, it's just another doomsday scenario. Thank you everyone for being so patient to listening, and thanks again for our speakers. I think there are lots of ideas and questions there that I'm sure we'll not discuss the last time today, but I think also it's a great way of just starting to think of what will be our research agenda in the years to come. What I find very interesting, a few reoccurring themes, but also coming back in different colors. And I really think that a lot of these things will come back to us in the next months. What I find also interesting right now is exactly this idea of there are so many moving parts and so many different levels. And I think that makes it challenging, but also particularly interesting from our research perspective. And maybe just to the last point that Oriol picked up, I really also noticed in the last few weeks that we just need much more discussion and much more listening and much more exchanging to actually understand of what's happening in different parts of Europe. I will leave it here. Thanks very much to our speakers. Thank you for everyone for joining, for our participants to ask so interesting questions and also give us their comments. Let me close by thanking our speakers. It was really great to have this variety of perspectives and also themes. And I hope to see all of you next week. Thank you so much. Bye.